My dog and I moved into our apartment building about 6 months ago. I always cross the street to begin our walk since my dog Acorn likes to walk on grass better than sidewalk. One day, about a month after I moved in, I was walking in front of the greenhouse directly across the street when the man who lives there stepped onto his porch. Typically, I'm a fairly antisocial person and would keep walking or maybe nod and say hello. But when Acorn was a puppy, I taught her to sit or lay down when someone greeted her so that she wouldn't jump on them, which eventually turned into her laying down, begging to be pet anytime she spots someone. So she saw this man leave his house and drop to the ground hoping to be pet. This left me standing awkwardly in front of his porch with a limp dog at the end of the leash. The guy seemed a little weird, wearing a bowler hat with long, straggly blonde hair and freakishly tall. But he came down the steps and chatted amicably with me as he stooped to pet Acorn. He asked me some questions, but nothing too weird. If I just moved into the apartment building, how I liked the neighborhood, etc. As I was leaving, a couple, who I later learned were John and Lydia, walked by with a pair of dogs, and I pretty much forgot about the encounter. About a week later, I was a couple blocks away from my apartment building in a nearby park when I met John as he was walking his dog. He asked if I knew the man in the greenhouse. I told him that I didn't really know him and that he just stopped to pet my dog. John frowned. He told me what a nice neighborhood this was, but warned me to be careful around that guy. I thanked him for the warning, but didn't really take it to heart because I figured that they had a neighborhood feud or something. I saw the man in the greenhouse a couple more times after that, but it was mostly just him waving from across the street or saying hello as he was going in or out of his house. Then, maybe a month or so later, I met Lydia. Her dog wasn't particularly friendly, so I was going to stay across the street from them when she picked her dog up and crossed over to me. Her dog was freaking out, barking and squirming in her arms to get down and attack mine, which was why I had wanted to stay across the street. I just wanted to make sure John remembered to warn you about that guy, she said, pointing to the greenhouse. I nodded and told her that he warned me, but didn't elaborate on why. I asked her why, and she just reiterated that it was good John told me. She said that once the man had screamed at her when her dog peed on his lawn, and that he hated dogs, so it worried her when she saw him petting Acorn. She warned me to be careful walking, especially at night. I understood why she was saying this, but at the same time her dog was kind of an asshole, so I wasn't too convinced that actually hated dogs and was talking to me for any other reason than to pet Acorn. For a few months, I didn't see many people on my walks since it was so cold out. It was early February when people started venturing out again. I was walking back from the park one day, and Leo, a man who lives in the house diagonal from the apartment building, stopped me to pet Acorn. He was chatting my ear off for a good 20 minutes as I was trying to politely extract myself and head inside. But since my dog was literally laying on top of his feet, I was stuck talking to him. After rambling on for a while, he leaned in towards me, suddenly serious. "Have you met the guy in the greenhouse?" he asked. At this point, I was getting weirded out by how many people had warned me about this guy. I nodded. "Stay away from that creep," he said fiercely. No one had really explained what the hell this guy had done to make half the neighborhood feel the need to warn me, so I asked Leo. He leaned in, close, and whispered, "Let's just say I wouldn't be surprised if they found dead girls in his walls." I was just kind of like, well, fuck. Thanks for the vague and ominous warning, Leo. But could you tell me something that actually would help me know why to avoid him? He didn't elaborate with my prompting, and I resolved to avoid walking in front of the greenhouse, if I could help it, especially at night. About a week later, I was out walking Acorn with my friend Claire. We were about 3 houses down from the green one, in front of Mrs. Katana's house. A car was driving past us kind of slowly, but I wasn't really paying attention to it since we weren't blocking the driveway or anything. Then the car slowed down to a stop on the far side of the road, directly across from where we were walking. The window to the car rolled down, and the guy from the greenhouse was inside. He leaned his head out the window and started talking to me, almost completely ignoring Claire, except for a creepy-ass smile. This was the first time I'd gotten a weird vibe from the guy, though I couldn't be sure if it was just because I'd been warned so many times about him or not. I was polite but abrupt with my answers, hoping he'd go away, and after a minute, he did. He drove less than 10 feet forward, did a U-turn, and pulled up to his own house. I felt a little bubble of panic well up in me at that point. I couldn't figure out why he'd pass his own house, drive halfway down the block, then do a U-turn, unless it was because he saw me. I asked Claire if she thought it was creepy, but she said it wasn't that weird, since it was broad daylight, and maybe he just wanted to be parked facing the other direction or something. Her rationalization comforted me, and I decided not to worry too much about it, but to just make more of an effort to avoid him. The more I started avoiding the man in the greenhouse, the more I just happened to run into him. One day I was walking Acorn by myself, and as I was leaving the building, I saw him pull up in front of his house and get out of his car. I turned and went the other way down the block, pretending I didn't see him. About 5 or 10 minutes later, I was a couple blocks away from my apartment building, standing in this grassy lot between two houses while Acorn sunbathed. It was nice enough out, so I was just standing there with my back to the road, letting Acorn enjoy the warm weather, when I heard a car turn down the street. I still kept my back to the road until I heard the car slowing down and honk. I turned around, and there's the guy from the greenhouse, stopped in the middle of the street with his window rolled down. Now that freaked me the fuck out because I just saw him getting out of his car at his house. He asked me how the dog was doing. I told him she was fine when she jumped up to stand next to me. I thought she was going to be whining to be pet, but she growled. I've never in my life heard her make a noise like that. Her teeth were bared and her hackles raised up. The guy didn't even seem fazed by it. He just kept leaning out his window, smiling at me, as though my dog wasn't practically foaming at the mouth. I made an excuse and swiftly walked away down the street the opposite direction his car was facing. When I got back to the apartment building, his car was parked out front. Not even a week later, I was outside talking to my neighbor Sadie when the man was driving by. He stopped his car and leaned out the window to say hi to me, completely ignoring Sadie before driving the rest of the way to his house. Sadie looked me dead in the eye and said, "Stay away from that fucking weirdo." I hadn't realized until this encounter that I'd never seen the man speak to anyone else, even when I was walking with Claire or talking to another neighbor. I started panicking at this point because no one had told me what the hell this guy did. Sadie told me that the guy had been in jail before, but she didn't know for what. She had pretty much the same schedule, working nights 3 days a week, and a few months before I moved in, she was leaving when she thought she saw something move in the back seat of her car. She went inside and got her boyfriend, and when they got back out of the car, her car door was open, and there was someone running down the street. She knew it was him, because the man running away was really tall and had a black hat on. She called the police, but nothing really came of it. Fast forward a couple days later, and I was outside, without Acorn for once, waiting for a ride. Chris, my next-door neighbor from inside the apartment building, pulled into one of the parking spots and stopped to talk to me while I waited. We were standing in the front door of my apartment building, directly across the street from the greenhouse. 10 minutes or so after Chris and I started talking, the door to the greenhouse opened, and I could see my creepy neighbor standing there out of the corner of my eye. The guy stood there for at least 5 minutes. I wanted to look over to see what he was doing, but I didn't want to call attention to myself. Then he yelled across the street to ask me how my dog was doing. I didn't have Acorn with me. I was in the middle of a conversation, and he was all the way across the street. I briefly considered ignoring him, but I didn't know what kind of a crazy person he was, and I didn't want to set him off or something. So I said, "She's good, thanks," and turned back to Chris. Then the guy started crossing the street towards us, and Chris started to say goodbye to head inside. I grabbed Chris's arm and asked him to wait with me. It was still daylight, but at this point, I was already freaked out enough by this man, and I definitely didn't want to be alone with him. Chris must have been able to see the fear in my eyes, because he nodded and stayed outside with me. Once my creepy neighbor crossed the street, he stood really close to me, even though I backed up towards Chris each time he stepped closer. He tried to strike up a conversation with me, with his back towards Chris, completely ignoring him. I just gave one-word answers, and eventually he left, going back into his house. I explained to Chris how I'd been warned by multiple people in the neighborhood to stay away from the man in the green house. Chris pointed out to me that the guy came outside, talked to me, then went straight back inside. It wasn't a coincidence. He was outside when we were. He must have been watching us. Chris waited with me until my ride came. Then a week ago, Acorn got sick and woke me up to go out around 2 or 3 in the morning for a couple days. Thursday night, she woke me up at 3. So I slipped on a pair of pants and grabbed my keys, not bothering to take my phone or flashlight to let her out. Since everyone had been warning me about the man in the green house, and I'm not a complete idiot, I walked about midway down my block before crossing the street in front of Mrs. Katana's house. As I crossed the street, Acorn froze for a second, then turned her head sharply to the right and growled lowly. I was wide awake at this point. My pulse beat out in an unsteady rhythm against my ribs as I turned the same direction as Acorn, trying to stay calm. For a moment, I didn't notice anything unusual until I saw movement and realized there was someone about midway down the next block, crossing the street in the opposite direction as me. I ushered Acorn the rest of the way across the road to the grass in front of Mrs. Katana's house, all the while keeping an eye on the person crossing the street as I did. There was only one street light for both blocks on the corner by the far end of my apartment building, which was between both blocks, so it was kind of hard to see the person. I was alert at this point, but tried to calm my frantic heart with the knowledge that this person was already outside before me. The trash can was on the corner of the street beneath the lamp, and I'm a total dumbass, so I started walking towards the trash can and incidentally towards the person. I was on the side of the street opposite my apartment building, and the person was still midway down the next block, but across the street from me. I reached the corner and was illuminated in the glow from the street lamp. I didn't realize I looked away from the person, but when I looked back up, I could make out their silhouette much better. From the closer distance, and with the aid of the streetlight, I could tell that it was a tall man wearing a hat. I immediately knew who it was. My blood ran cold. He was closer than before, frozen in place. I tilted my head down so it was to look like I was looking at Acorn, but kept my eyes on him. After a moment, he hunched his shoulders and began tiptoeing slowly across the street, towards the side I was on. I was frozen in fear. He must have been crouching because he thought I couldn't see him and that he had the upper hand. So I didn't want to clue him in on the fact that I could see him. Rather than run as fast as I could to the safety of my building like I wanted to, I walked as calmly as I could manage across the street to my building. I had to take my eye off the man for a second when I reached my building, and when I looked back up, he was gone. I ran as fast as I could to the door and swiped into my building. There was no way he could have gone into a house that fast. Plus, he wasn't anywhere near his own house. He had been creeping between 2 parked cars when I saw him last, and the only explanation I could think of was that he didn't see me cross to the building and was crouched down between 2 cars, waiting for me to walk by. I shudder to think of what could have happened had I not noticed him. So creepy man in the greenhouse, let's not meet. Thanks for listening, guys. Sinful here. Thank you for watching the video. Please make sure to leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe to join the Sinful Nation if you haven't already.